In a world where the sky belonged to men and women were told their place was on the ground, one pilot defied every rule written in blood and steel. While her male colleagues saw only empty air above enemy territory, she saw opportunity. While they counted their losses, she counted her targets. In just 12 minutes on a cold morning in 1943, she would prove that the most dangerous predator in the sky wasn't the one they expected. This is the story of a woman who hid her identity, her skills, and her wings until the moment she unleashed hell from above, destroying 5 enemy aircraft in a display of aerial mastery that would be whispered about in hangars for decades to come. But her greatest victory wasn't in the kill she claimed that day. It was in the secret she kept hidden beneath her flight suit, a secret that would change the course of aerial warfare forever. The morning fog clung to the airfield like a shroud, muffling the sound of boots on wet concrete and the distant hum of aircraft engines warming up for another day of war. Lieutenant Sarah Chun pulled her leather flight jacket tighter around her shoulders, feeling the familiar weight of her identity papers in the inside pocket. Papers that listed her name as Samuel Chun, male, age 24, born in San Francisco to Chinese immigrant parents. It was March 15th, 1943, and the world was drowning in the largest conflict it had ever seen. The Pacific Theater stretched across thousands of miles of ocean, where American forces battled Japanese pilots in deadly aerial dances that determined the fate of nations. But in this war where courage was measured in altitude gained and enemies destroyed, there was one rule that seemed unbreakable. Women did not fly combat missions. Sarah had been living a lie for 8 months now, ever since she had walked into the recruitment office wearing her deceased brother's clothes and carrying his draft card. Samuel Chun had died in a factory accident 3 weeks before his scheduled induction, and Sarah had made a decision that would have shocked her traditional Chinese parents and scandalized the military brass if they had known. She was going to take his place. The deception had required more than just cutting her hair short and binding her chest. Sarah had spent months studying her brother's mannerisms, deepening her voice, and learning to walk with the confident swagger expected of a young man. She had practiced spitting and cursing like the other pilots, had learned to drink beer without grimacing, and had mastered the art of crude jokes told in the barracks after lights out. But the hardest part wasn't the physical transformation or even the constant fear of discovery. It was the loneliness. Sarah couldn't form real friendships when every conversation was built on a fundamental lie. She couldn't share stories from her childhood, couldn't talk about her dreams or fears, and she certainly couldn't mention the flying lessons she had secretly taken from an old barnstormer named Jack Murphy back in California. Those lessons had been her rebellion against a world that told her she belonged in a kitchen or a factory, not in the cockpit of an airplane. Every Saturday morning for 2 years, while her parents thought she was working at the local market, Sarah had been learning to read the wind, to feel the subtle changes in engine vibration that meant trouble, and to execute barrel rolls and diving attacks with a precision that impressed even the gruff old pilot who taught her. Jack Murphy had been a veteran of the First World War, a man who had seen too much death to care about social conventions. When Sarah first approached him, disguised as a boy and claiming to be interested in flying, he had seen through her deception within minutes. But instead of sending her away, he had made her a deal. He would teach her to fly if she promised to be twice as good as any male pilot he had ever trained. Sarah had kept that promise. By the time she enlisted in her brother's place, she could fly circles around most of the other recruits. But she had to hide that skill, pretending to be just another eager young man learning the basics of aerial combat. She made deliberate mistakes during training, asked obvious questions, and forced herself to crash land twice to maintain her cover as an average pilot. The other men in her squadron had accepted Samuel Chun as one of their own. There was Rodriguez, a hotshot from Texas who claimed he could shoot a mosquito off a cow's nose at 300 yards. There was Williams, a quiet farm boy from Iowa who wrote letters to his girlfriend every night and read them aloud to anyone who would listen. And there was Lieutenant Commander Harrison, their squadron leader, a tough New Yorker who had already shot down 4 Japanese planes and wore his experience like armor. Harrison had taken a liking to Samuel, often choosing him for the easier patrol missions and offering advice about combat tactics. Sarah appreciated the gesture, but chafed at the protection. She was ready for real combat, hungry for the chance to prove herself, but she couldn't push too hard without raising suspicions. The squadron was based on a small island in the Pacific, one of dozens of forward operating bases that served as stepping stones in the American advance toward Japan. Life on the island was rough and monotonous. The men slept in metal huts that baked during the day and turned cold at night. They ate canned food, played endless card games, and wrote letters home that might never arrive. Sarah had created an elaborate backstory for Samuel Chun, complete with a fictional girlfriend named Margaret and concerned parents in San Francisco. She wrote fake letters to herself and read them aloud during mail call, maintaining the illusion that someone back home cared whether Samuel lived or died. In reality, her parents believed both their children were dead, and Sarah carried that guilt like a stone in her chest. The morning routine never varied. Wake up at 5:30, dress quickly in the dim light, and shuffle to the mess hall for coffee that could strip paint and eggs that might have been real once upon a time. Then came the briefing, where Harrison would outline the day's missions while pointing at maps covered with red pins marking enemy positions. Most days brought routine patrols, flying in formation over empty ocean while scanning the horizon for enemy aircraft or ships. The work was dangerous, but rarely eventful. Japanese pilots had grown scarce in their sector, and most missions ended with nothing more exciting than a flock of seabirds to break the monotony. But Sarah could feel that something was different about this particular morning. Harrison seemed more tense than usual during the briefing, and there were rumors of increased Japanese activity to the north. Intelligence reports suggested that a major enemy offensive was being planned, and American forces were scrambling to prepare their defenses. As the pilots filed out of the briefing room, Rodriguez caught up with Sarah near the door. "Hey, Chun," he said, using the casual tone that had become familiar over months of shared danger. "You hear about Jenkins from the 42nd Squadron?" Sarah shook her head, though she dreaded what she might hear. Pilot casualties were a constant reality on the island, discussed with the kind of casual acceptance that came from living with death as a daily companion. "Got shot down 3 days ago over the northern patrol area," Rodriguez continued, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. "They found his plane this morning. Looks like he took down 2 of theirs before they got him." The news hit Sarah like a physical blow. Jenkins had been a good pilot, careful and experienced. If the Japanese had managed to shoot him down, it meant they were bringing better planes or better pilots into the area. The war was escalating, and everyone knew it. After breakfast, the pilots headed to the flight line, where their aircraft waited like sleeping metal birds. Sarah's plane was AP-40 Warhawk, a sturdy fighter with shark teeth painted on the nose, and her brother's initials stenciled below the cockpit. She had grown to love the aircraft's reliable engine and heavy machine guns, though she sometimes dreamed of flying the newer P-51 Mustangs that were reaching other squadrons. The daily inspection ritual was second nature now. Sarah checked every surface for damage, tested the control surfaces, and examined the ammunition belts that fed her 650 caliber machine guns. Each bullet represented a chance to defend her squadron and her country, though she had never fired her guns in anger. Every mission so far had been routine patrol work, the kind of flying that was necessary but unremarkable. As she completed her inspection, Sarah noticed Chief Petty Officer Morgan watching her from across the flight line. Morgan was the squadron's head mechanic, a grizzled veteran who seemed to know everything about engines and nothing about social pleasantries. He had been giving Sarah strange looks for the past few weeks, and she worried that he might be growing suspicious about her true identity. Morgan approached with the rolling walk of a man who had spent decades around heavy machinery. "Chun," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had been fixing airplanes since before most of the pilots were born. "Your engine's been running a little rough on the port side. I wanted to take her up for a test flight before the next mission." Sarah nodded, grateful for any excuse to get airborne. Flying was the only time she felt truly free, the only moments when she could forget about maintaining her false identity and simply exist as a pilot. In the air, skill mattered more than gender, and reflexes counted more than social expectations. 20 minutes later, Sarah was climbing through 3,000 feet, feeling the familiar thrill of leaving the Earth behind. The morning sun painted the ocean below in shades of gold and blue, and for a few precious minutes, the war seemed very far away. She tested the engine at various power settings, confirmed that Morgan's concerns were unfounded, and then allowed herself the luxury of some aerobatic maneuvers far from the watchful eyes of her squadron mates. Rolling inverted and diving toward the water before pulling up in a graceful arc, Sarah felt her heart racing with pure joy. This was what she had been born to do, what she had risked everything to achieve. In these moments, all the lies and deception seemed worthwhile. As she leveled off at cruising altitude and turned back toward the island, Sarah spotted something that made her blood run cold. Far to the north, almost at the limit of her vision, she could see a formation of aircraft approaching at high altitude. The silhouettes were wrong for American planes, and they were flying in the tight formation patterns favored by Japanese pilots. Sarah keyed her radio, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Base control, this is Chun on test flight. I have visual contact with enemy aircraft, bearing 010, approximately 12 aircraft. Altitude appears to be 15,000 feet. The response was immediate and urgent. "Chun, confirm enemy aircraft sighting. Are you certain of identification?" Sarah studied the distant formation through her cockpit canopy, using the recognition skills that had been drilled into every pilot until they became second nature. The wing shapes, the engine arrangement, the way the aircraft moved through the air, everything confirmed her initial assessment. Base control, positive identification on enemy aircraft. 12 Japanese fighters, possibly Zeros, heading directly for our position. Estimated time to contact, 8 minutes. The radio crackled with urgent commands as the base scrambled to respond to the threat. Sarah could hear Harrison's voice cutting through the chatter, ordering all available aircraft to launch immediately. But she knew that 8 minutes wasn't enough time for a proper scramble. Most of her squadron mates were still on the ground, their engines cold, their weapons not yet loaded. As the lone American fighter in position to intercept, Sarah faced a decision that would define her entire future. She could follow orders and return to base, letting the enemy formation reach the island uncontested while her squadron struggled to get airborne. Or she could do what every fiber of her being told her to do, turn north and engage 12 enemy aircraft in single combat. The mathematics of aerial warfare were stark and unforgiving. 1 against 12 was not a battle, it was suicide. But as Sarah watched the enemy formation growing larger on the horizon, she thought about Jenkins lying dead in his crashed aircraft, about the friends and fellow pilots sleeping peacefully on the island below, and about the promise she had made to Jack Murphy to be twice as good as any male pilot he had ever trained. Sarah banked her fighter to the north and pushed the throttle forward, feeling the Merlin engine respond with a surge of power that pressed her back into her seat. For the first time in 8 months of pretending to be someone else, she was about to show the world exactly who Samuel Chun really was. The enemy formation grew larger with each passing second as Sarah climbed toward the approaching Japanese fighters. At 12,000 feet, she could make out the distinctive profiles of Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, their polished aluminum skins gleaming in the morning sun like deadly silver birds. Each aircraft represented years of Japanese engineering and months of pilot training, and together they formed a coordinated killing machine that had dominated Pacific skies for the first 2 years of the war. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she calculated angles and distances with the cold precision her secret instructor had taught her. 12 against 1 were impossible odds by any reasonable measure, but Jack Murphy had never been interested in reasonable. During their training sessions over the California countryside, he had hammered home a single principle that now echoed in her mind. In aerial combat, the pilot who sees first, thinks fastest, and shoots straightest lives to tell about it. Everything else is just noise. The radio chatter from her base had become increasingly frantic as ground control realized the scope of the approaching threat. Harrison's voice cut through the static, sharp with concern and growing anger. "Chen, what is your position? Return to base immediately for coordinated response. Do not, repeat, do not engage enemy formation alone." Sarah keyed her microphone, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "Base control, Chun here. Enemy formation is moving too fast for a coordinated response. I am in optimal position for initial engagement. We'll delay enemy advance until squadron arrives." It was a careful way of saying she was about to attempt something that military doctrine considered impossible and common sense labeled as suicide. But Sarah had spent 8 months watching her squadron mates prepare for combat, while she pretended to be less skilled than she actually was. She had bitten her tongue during tactical discussions where her input might have saved lives, and she had flown conservative patrol patterns when her instincts screamed for more aggressive action. Now, climbing through 14,000 feet with 12 enemy fighters bearing down on her home base, Sarah Chun was finally free to show what a woman could accomplish in aerial combat. The Japanese formation was flying in a textbook finger-4 pattern, with 3 flights of 4 aircraft each. The lead flight held the center position, while 2 additional flights spread out on either side in a formation designed to provide mutual support and overlapping fields of fire. It was disciplined, professional, and exactly the kind of tactical approach that had made Zero pilots the terror of the Pacific. But Sarah could see something that the Japanese pilots couldn't. Their formation, while tactically sound for most situations, created a blind spot directly beneath the trailing flight. If she could approach from below and behind, climbing at maximum power while staying in that blind spot, she might be able to get close enough for a killing shot before the enemy realized they were under attack. The plan was audacious to the point of insanity. She would have perhaps 30 seconds from the moment she opened fire until the entire formation turned to engage her. In that brief window, she would need to destroy or disable as many aircraft as possible, then somehow survive the coordinated response of the remaining enemy pilots. Sarah adjusted her heading and began a shallow climb that would bring her up behind the Japanese formation. She reduced power slightly to avoid creating a visible exhaust trail that might give away her position, trading speed for stealth as she closed the distance. The enemy aircraft were now clearly visible, their red meatball insignia stark against their silver fuselages. As she climbed into position, Sarah's mind automatically ran through the checklist that would prepare her for combat. Gunsight was set for deflection, shooting at the optimal range for her 650 caliber machine guns. Safety switches were off, with all weapons armed and ready. Throttle quadrant was set for maximum performance, giving her engine every possible advantage in the fight to come. But beyond the mechanical preparations, Sarah was also drawing on skills and knowledge that her squadron mates didn't possess. During her secret training with Jack Murphy, she had learned techniques that weren't taught in standard military flight schools. Murphy had been a pioneer of energy fighting, using altitude and speed as weapons just as deadly as bullets. He had taught her to think three-dimensionally, to use the vertical plane as an escape route and an attack vector. Most importantly, Murphy had taught her to fight like a smaller, weaker opponent who couldn't afford to make mistakes. While male pilots often relied on superior firepower and aggressive tactics, Sarah had learned to be cunning, patient, and absolutely precise. Every shot had to count, every maneuver had to serve multiple purposes, and every second had to be used to maximum advantage. The Japanese formation was now only 2 miles ahead and slightly above her position. Sarah could see individual pilots in their cockpits, their heads turning left and right as they scanned for threats. They were professionals, alert and competent, but they were looking for enemy aircraft approaching from expected directions. No one anticipated a lone fighter climbing up from directly beneath them. Sarah began her final approach, pulling back on the stick to steepen her climb while adding power to maintain airspeed. The angle was perfect. She was rising toward the trailing flight like a shark approaching its prey from the dark depths below. In 30 seconds, she would be close enough to open fire. In 45 seconds, the entire character of the engagement would be determined. The lead aircraft in the trailing flight was a Zero flown by what appeared to be an experienced pilot. His aircraft showed the subtle modifications and personal markings that indicated a veteran aviator, someone who had probably survived dozens of combat missions and shot down multiple American pilots. In peacetime, Sarah might have admired his skill and dedication. In war, he was simply a target to be destroyed as quickly and efficiently as possible. As the distance closed to optimal firing range, Sarah could feel the familiar calm that had always settled over her during challenging flights. Time seemed to slow, sounds became muted, and her vision narrowed to focus entirely on the tactical situation ahead. This was the state that Jack Murphy had called the zone, a moment of perfect clarity where training, instinct, and determination combined to create something approaching perfection. 20 seconds to firing position. Sarah could now see details on the enemy aircraft, antenna wires, gun ports, even the leather flying helmets worn by individual pilots. The trailing flight was maintaining perfect formation, unaware that death was approaching from below at nearly 300 miles per hour. 15 seconds. Sarah made minute adjustments to her heading and climb angle, positioning herself for the optimal attack run. Her plan was to take the trailing flight first, destroying or disabling all 4 aircraft before the rest of the formation could react. It was an ambitious goal, but the element of surprise and her advantageous position made it theoretically possible. 10 seconds. The enemy aircraft filled her gun sight, growing larger with each heartbeat. Sarah's finger moved to the trigger, feeling the familiar texture of the metal surface that would unleash 6 streams of .50 caliber destruction. Everything she had trained for, everything she had sacrificed and risked was about to be tested in the most deadly examination possible. 5 seconds. Sarah could hear her own breathing in the confined space of her cockpit, could feel her heart beating against her flight suit. The morning sun was warm on her shoulders through the cockpit canopy, and for a moment she thought about how strange it was that such a beautiful day would be marked by violence and death. 3 seconds. The Japanese pilot in the nearest Zero turned his head slightly, as if sensing danger from an unexpected quarter. Sarah saw his eyes widen behind his goggles as he spotted her aircraft climbing toward his formation. His mouth opened, probably to shout a warning over his radio, but he was 3 seconds too late. 1 second. Sarah pulled the trigger. 6 .50 caliber machine guns roared to life, sending a stream of high-velocity bullets into the trailing flight of enemy aircraft. The sound was tremendous, a continuous thunderclap that shook her entire aircraft and announced to every pilot in the sky that the battle had begun. Brass shell casings tumbled past her cockpit like golden rain, and the familiar smell of burned gunpowder filled her oxygen mask. Her first burst caught the lead Zero of the trailing flight squarely in the engine compartment. The enemy aircraft's cowling erupted in a shower of sparks and metal fragments as her bullets tore through the radial engine and into the fuel system beyond. White smoke began streaming from the damaged fighter, followed quickly by orange flames that spread along the wing roots and back toward the cockpit. Sarah held the trigger down for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to ensure a kill, short enough to conserve ammunition for the remaining targets. As the damaged Zero began its death spiral toward the ocean below, she was already shifting her aim to the second aircraft in the formation. The second Zero pilot had finally realized what was happening and was beginning an evasive turn to the left, but Sarah had anticipated the maneuver. Her bullets found their mark just as the enemy aircraft started its turn, striking the wing root and severing control cables that sent the fighter into an uncontrolled roll. The third and fourth aircraft in the trailing flight were now fully aware of the attack and were scattering in different directions, but Sarah had climbed high enough to maintain visual contact with all of them. She selected the third zero and fired another precise burst that shattered its canopy and silenced its engine. In the space of 8 seconds, Sarah had destroyed 3 enemy aircraft and damaged a 4th. But now the real test was beginning. The remaining 8 Japanese fighters had completed their turns and were diving toward her position with the coordinated fury of a professional fighter squadron. Their attack was perfectly executed, with aircraft approaching from multiple angles to prevent her from focusing on any single threat. Sarah's radio erupted with excited chatter as her distant squadron mates tried to make sense of what their instruments were telling them. Ground control was shouting coordinates and vectors, while Harrison's voice carried a mixture of amazement and concern. But Sarah ignored the radio traffic, focusing entirely on the immediate tactical situation. 8 against 1 were still impossible odds, but she had changed the mathematics of the engagement. Instead of facing 12 fresh enemy pilots in undamaged aircraft, she was now fighting 8 pilots who were angry, surprised, and operating without their carefully planned formation integrity. It was still a losing proposition, but it was no longer hopeless. The first group of attacking Zeros was approaching from her 11 o'clock position, their guns already winking with muzzle flashes as they fired long-range bursts in her direction. Sarah could see the tracer rounds arcing toward her aircraft like deadly fireworks, and she knew that staying in her current position would mean certain death. She rolled inverted and pulled back hard on the stick, using the vertical dive to build airspeed while simultaneously spoiling the aim of the attacking fighters. The maneuver was violent and disorienting, pulling multiple GS as her aircraft accelerated toward the ocean surface far below. But it accomplished its purpose. The first wave of enemy fire passed harmlessly overhead, while Sarah gained the speed and position she would need for the next phase of the engagement. As she dove toward the water, Sarah was already planning her next move. The Japanese pilots would expect her to level off and attempt to escape, but she had no intention of running. Instead, she was going to use the ocean surface as a tactical ally, forcing her enemies to attack from above while she used superior knowledge of energy management to turn the tables on her pursuers. The real fight was just beginning, and Sarah Chun was exactly where she had always dreamed of being, alone in the sky with her aircraft, her weapons, and her skills about to prove that courage and determination could overcome any odds. The ocean surface rushed up towards Sarah's diving fighter at a terrifying rate, growing from a distant blue carpet to a detailed seascape of waves and foam in a matter of seconds. Her airspeed indicator climbed past 400 miles per hour as she used gravity and engine power to build the energy that would keep her alive in the fight to come. Behind her, 8 Japanese fighters followed in loose pursuit, their pilots probably assuming they were chasing a panicked American who would either level off in time to be shot down or crash into the sea through pilot error. Both assumptions were wrong. At 500 feet above the water, Sarah hauled back on her control stick with both hands, pulling her aircraft out of its dive in a maneuver that subjected her body to crushing G-forces and her airframe to stresses that approached its design limits. The horizon spun wildly as she converted her downward velocity into a climbing turn that brought her up and around in a vertical loop that would have been impossible without the speed she had gained in the dive. The pursuing Japanese fighters, committed to their own diving attacks, suddenly found themselves in the worst possible tactical position. They were fast and low, with an American fighter climbing above them in perfect position for a high-side attack. The roles had been completely reversed in the span of 30 seconds. Sarah completed her loop at the top of the circle, rolling inverted to acquire the nearest enemy fighter in her gun sight. The Zero pilot was pulling out of his own dive and beginning a climbing turn to the left, but he was moving too slowly to escape. Sarah led him perfectly, calculating the deflection angle needed to place her bullets where his aircraft would be rather than where it currently was. Her machine guns roared again, sending another stream of 50 caliber rounds into the turning Zero. The bullets struck just behind the cockpit, tearing through the aircraft's spine and severing control cables that left the fighter wallowing helplessly in the air. The Japanese pilot fought his controls for several seconds before his aircraft rolled inverted and dove into the sea, trailing white smoke and leaving a brief splash on the ocean surface. 4 down, 8 to go. But the remaining Japanese pilots were no longer surprised amateurs. They had seen their squadron mates destroyed by precise shooting and superior tactics, and they were responding with the coordinated professionalism that had made them masters of Pacific skies. Instead of pursuing Sarah individually, they were forming up into 2-4 aircraft flights that could provide mutual support and overlapping fields of fire. Sarah found herself in the classic fighter pilot's dilemma. She had superior position and energy, but she was outnumbered by a significant margin. Every attack she made would expose her to counterattack from multiple directions, and she couldn't afford to make a single mistake. The mathematics were simple. The Japanese pilots could afford to miss their shots, but she could not. She chose her next target carefully, selecting a zero that was slightly separated from the main formation as its pilot maneuvered for a better attack angle. The enemy aircraft was climbing toward her position, its pilot probably planning to get above her for a diving attack. It was a sound tactical decision, but it left him temporarily isolated from his wingman's protective fire. Sarah rolled into a diving turn that brought her down on the climbing zero from an angle that made return fire impossible. The Japanese pilot saw her coming and tried to turn away, but he was climbing slowly and couldn't match her speed advantage. Her bullets found their mark in a 2-second burst that shattered the enemy fighter's engine and left it smoking and losing altitude rapidly. The pilot managed to keep his damaged aircraft flying long enough to clear the area, but Sarah could see that he was heading for the water with no chance of making it back to his home base. In aerial combat, a damaged aircraft that couldn't return home was considered destroyed, regardless of whether the pilot survived the landing. 5 down, 7 to go. But her latest attack had brought her within range of the main enemy formation, and the remaining Japanese pilots were converging on her position from multiple directions. Sarah found herself in the center of a deadly web, with enemy fighters approaching from her 11 o'clock, 2 o'clock, and 5 o'clock positions simultaneously. This was the moment that separated skilled pilots from exceptional ones. In the span of the next 10 seconds, Sarah would either demonstrate the superiority of her training and tactics, or she would join the growing list of Allied pilots who had underestimated their opponents. She chose to attack the threat from her 11 o'clock position first, turning toward the approaching zero in a head-on pass that would bring both aircraft within gun range at the same time. It was a dangerous maneuver that depended on superior marksmanship and nerves of steel, but it would also allow her to eliminate one threat while positioning herself for escape from the others. The approaching zero grew larger in her windscreen with each passing second, its wings beginning to sparkle with muzzle flashes as the Japanese pilot opened fire at maximum range. Sarah held her own fire, waiting for the optimal moment when her concentrated burst would have the greatest chance of success. At 300 yards, she squeezed her trigger and felt her aircraft shudder as 6 machine guns fired in perfect synchronization. The two fighters flashed past each other at a combined speed of nearly 600 miles per hour, and for a moment Sarah wasn't certain who had won the deadly encounter. Then she looked back and saw the Zero falling toward the ocean with its engine in flames and its pilot slumped forward in his cockpit. Her bullets had found their mark in the crucial seconds before the enemy pilot could bring his own guns to bear. 6 down, 6 to go. But the maneuver had cost her altitude and airspeed, and the remaining Japanese fighters were closing in from multiple directions. Sarah found herself in a defensive position for the first time since the engagement began, forced to react to enemy moves rather than dictating the terms of combat herself. The nearest threat was a Zero approaching from her right side, its pilot firing short bursts as he tried to lead her aircraft properly. Sarah could see the tracer rounds passing close to her canopy, some so near that she could hear them cracking through the air above the sound of her engine. She rolled hard to the left and pulled into a tight spiral that used her superior power-to-weight ratio to outturn the pursuing fighter. The Japanese pilot tried to follow, but his aircraft couldn't match her rate of turn without losing dangerous amounts of airspeed. As his turn radius widened, Sarah reversed direction and found herself behind him in perfect firing position. Her next burst was devastating, striking the zero in the fuel tank area and causing an explosion that tore the aircraft apart in midair. The pilot had no chance to bail out before his fighter disintegrated in a shower of burning fragments. 7 down, 5 to go. The remaining Japanese pilots were now showing signs of the psychological pressure that came from watching their squadron mates destroyed by a single enemy fighter. Their attacks were becoming less coordinated and more aggressive as individual pilots abandoned tactical discipline in favor of personal revenge against the American who had decimated their formation. This shift from coordinated tactics to individual combat played directly into Sarah's hands. Instead of facing a disciplined formation that could bring overwhelming firepower to bear, she was now fighting 5 separate engagements against pilots whose judgment was clouded by anger and frustration. She selected her next target from among the 3 Zeros that were attempting to get on her tail, choosing the aircraft that was closest to achieving a firing position. The Japanese pilot was skilled and aggressive, using short bursts of fire to force Sarah into defensive maneuvers while gradually closing the distance between them. But Sarah had been taught by Jack Murphy never to run from a pursuer when turning to fight was an option. She waited until the enemy pilot was committed to his attack run, then executed a maneuver that Murphy had called a snap roll reversal, a violent combination of aileron and rudder inputs that flipped her aircraft inverted and reversed its direction so quickly that physics barely had time to object. The pursuing Zero pilot, caught completely off guard by the sudden maneuver, found himself overshooting Sarah's position and flying directly into her line of fire. Her bullets struck his aircraft in the wing root area, severing control cables and hydraulic lines that left him flying an uncontrollable aircraft. The damaged Zero began a slow spiral toward the ocean, its pilot fighting desperately to maintain level flight. Sarah watched just long enough to confirm that the aircraft was finished as a threat, then turned her attention to the remaining 4 enemies who were regrouping for another coordinated attack. 8 down, 4 to go. But these final 4 pilots were clearly the elite of the enemy formation, the flight leaders and experienced veterans who had survived the initial chaos through superior skill and tactical awareness. Their movements were more cautious now, more professional, as they established overlapping patrol patterns that would prevent Sarah from isolating individual targets. Sarah realized that her tactics would need to change for this final phase of the engagement. The element of surprise was gone. Her ammunition was running low, and her engine was showing signs of stress from the prolonged high-power operation. She would need to be perfect in everything she did from this point forward. The radio in her cockpit crackled with urgent transmissions as her squadron mates finally approached the combat area. Harrison's voice cut through the static with orders and position reports, but Sarah ignored the chatter. In aerial combat, there were no cavalry charges or last-minute rescues. Victory or defeat would be determined by what happened in the next few minutes, and she couldn't afford to be distracted by well-meaning help that was still several minutes away. She climbed toward the morning sun, using its glare to mask her position while she planned her final attacks. Below her, 4 Japanese fighters circled like sharks, their pilots probably discussing coordination and tactics over their radio frequencies. They knew that time was working against them. More American fighters were approaching, and their fuel state was becoming a critical factor. Sarah counted her remaining ammunition and calculated firing times, determining that she had perhaps 40 seconds of trigger time remaining. Against 4 experienced pilots in undamaged aircraft, 40 seconds would need to be enough to decide the outcome of a battle that had already exceeded every reasonable expectation. She selected her first target and rolled into the attack that would determine whether Samuel Chun became a legend or simply another casualty statistic in the vast Pacific War. The flight back to base became a careful dance between a damaged aircraft and a pilot who was running on pure adrenaline and determination. Sarah's Warhawk limped through the morning sky like a wounded bird, its port wing drooping noticeably, and its engine running roughly enough to send vibrations through the entire airframe. The fuel vapor she had noticed during combat was growing stronger, and several of her instruments had failed completely, leaving her to navigate by compass and dead reckoning. But the physical challenges of flying her battle-damaged fighter were nothing compared to the mental pressure of the radio chatter that filled her headphones. Harrison's voice was the most prominent, alternating between concerned questions about her aircraft's condition and amazed observations about the engagement they had witnessed from a distance. Other pilots in the approaching squadron were adding their own commentary, using words like miraculous and impossible to describe what they had seen. Ground control had recorded every moment of the 12-minute battle, and the radar operators were already providing preliminary counts of enemy aircraft destroyed. The numbers were so extraordinary that Sarah could hear the disbelief in their voices as they transmitted updates to higher command levels. 12 Japanese fighters engaged by a single American pilot. 12 confirmed kills. 0 American losses. It was the kind of combat record that would make Samuel Chun famous throughout the Pacific Theater, the subject of newspaper articles and military decorations that would bring attention from the highest levels of command. And that attention, Sarah knew, would inevitably expose the deception she had maintained for 8 months. As her base came into view ahead, Sarah could see that word of the engagement had already spread throughout the island. Ground crews were running toward the flight line. Staff officers were emerging from headquarters buildings, and what appeared to be every off-duty pilot on the base was gathering to witness her landing. The welcoming committee was impressive, but Sarah would have preferred to slip back onto the base unnoticed. She entered the traffic pattern with her landing gear down and her flaps extended, trying to compensate for the damaged handling characteristics that made her aircraft want to roll to the left. The approach required constant correction and careful power management, but she managed to touch down smoothly despite the crosswind and the crowd of spectators lining the runway. As her fighter rolled to a stop near the operations building, Sarah could see Harrison running toward her aircraft with a mixture of relief and excitement on his face. Behind him came Rodriguez, Williams, and the other pilots of her squadron, all of them eager to hear first-hand details of the engagement that had already become legendary. But it was Chief Petty Officer Morgan who reached her aircraft first, his experienced eyes immediately focusing on the battle damage that scored her wings and fuselage. He climbed onto her wing while she was still shutting down her engine, examining the bullet holes and structural damage with the professional concern of a mechanic who had seen too many pilots fail to return from combat. "Jesus, Chin," Morgan said, his gravelly voice carrying clearly over the dying whine of her engine. "Looks like you took a beating up there. How the hell did you keep this thing in the air?" Sarah pulled off her leather-flying helmet and ran her fingers through her sweat-soaked hair, trying to formulate an answer that wouldn't reveal more than she intended. "Superior American engineering," she said, forcing her voice to maintain its practiced masculine register despite the emotional and physical exhaustion that was beginning to overwhelm her. Harrison arrived at her aircraft just as Sarah was climbing down from the cockpit, and his expression was a mixture of pride, concern, and professional curiosity. "Samuel," he said, using the name that had become second nature to everyone on the base, "I've been flying combat missions for 2 years, and I've never seen anything like what you just did up there. How did you know to attack from below? Where did you learn those maneuvers?" The question was innocent enough, but Sarah could hear the undertone of suspicion that came from an experienced officer who had just witnessed something that defied conventional explanation. Harrison was beginning to wonder how a pilot he had considered competent but unremarkable had suddenly displayed skills that exceeded those of the most experienced fighter pilots in the Pacific Theater. "Training kicks in when you need it most," Sarah replied, keeping her answer deliberately vague while she tried to think of a way to deflect the growing attention. "I guess I remembered more from flight school than I thought I did." But Rodriguez was already asking more detailed questions about specific maneuvers he had seen during the engagement, and Williams wanted to know about ammunition management and target selection. The other pilots were crowding closer, all of them eager to learn from someone who had just accomplished the impossible. Sarah found herself at the center of a growing circle of pilots and ground crew members, all asking questions that required technical knowledge and tactical expertise that Samuel Chen wasn't supposed to possess. Each answer she gave seemed to generate 3 more questions, and she could feel the foundation of her deception beginning to crack under the weight of scrutiny. It was Morgan who noticed the problem first. As the crowd of pilots peppered her with questions, the old mechanic was conducting his own examination of her aircraft and her equipment. His experienced eyes missed nothing. Not the way her parachute harness had been adjusted, not the personal items in her cockpit, and certainly not the subtle differences in her physical appearance that 8 months of military life hadn't been able to completely mask. When the initial excitement of her return had died down and the crowd began to disperse, Morgan approached her near the operations building where she was filling out her combat report. His expression was serious, but not hostile, and he spoke in the low, careful tones of a man who was trying to avoid creating a scene. "Chun," he said, glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "I've been working on aircraft and pilots for more than 20 years, and I've learned to notice things that other people might miss. You want to explain to me why your flight suit fits like it was tailored for someone with a different body type?" Sarah felt her heart stop for a moment, but she forced herself to maintain eye contact with the old mechanic. "I don't know what you mean, Chief," she said, though they both knew it was a lie. Morgan stepped closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I mean that I've been watching you for weeks, noticing little things that didn't add up. The way you walk, the way you talk when you think nobody's listening, the way you've modified your equipment. But mostly, I mean the way you just flew combat up there like someone who learned from a master pilot, not from military flight school." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a jeep carrying 2 officers that Sarah didn't recognize. Their uniforms indicated that they were from higher headquarters, probably staff officers from the command level that controlled multiple squadrons and bases. Their presence could only mean that word of her engagement had already reached the upper levels of military command. The senior officer, a colonel with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, approached with Harrison trailing behind him. "Lieutenant Chun," the colonel said, his voice carrying the authority of rank and the respect due to a pilot who had just achieved something extraordinary. "I'm Colonel Matthews from Pacific Air Command. We need to discuss your engagement this morning in some detail." Sarah snapped to attention and saluted, her mind racing as she tried to anticipate what kinds of questions she would be expected to answer. "Yes, sir," she replied, hoping that her voice didn't betray the growing panic she felt. Colonel Matthews glanced around at the crowd of spectators that was still lingering nearby, then gestured toward the operations building. "Let's discuss this privately," he said. "Your squadron leader tells me that your performance today was unlike anything he's seen from you before. I'm curious to hear your explanation for that." As they walked toward the building, Sarah caught Morgan's eye one more time. The old mechanic was watching her with an expression that might have been sympathetic, and he gave her an almost imperceptible nod that seemed to say he understood the impossible position she was in. Inside the operations building, Colonel Matthews settled himself behind Harrison's desk and opened a folder that contained what appeared to be preliminary reports about the morning's engagement. "Lieutenant Chun," he began, his tone professional but not unfriendly. "According to multiple witnesses and radar tracking, you engaged 12 enemy aircraft single-handedly and destroyed all 12 without loss of your own aircraft. Is that an accurate summary?" Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady if she tried to speak. "Furthermore," the colonel continued, "you accomplished this using tactics and maneuvers that suggest a level of training and experience far beyond what your service record indicates. Your squadron leader tells me that until this morning, you were considered a competent but unremarkable pilot. Can you explain this discrepancy?" The question hung in the air like a sword over Sarah's head. She had perhaps 30 seconds to come up with an explanation that would satisfy a senior officer who was clearly suspicious about something that didn't add up. And in that moment, looking at the reports spread across the desk and seeing the growing doubt in Harrison's eyes, Sarah Chun made a decision that would change everything. "Sir," she said, her voice steady despite the enormity of what she was about to reveal, "there's something about my background that isn't in my service record. Something that explains how I was able to do what I did this morning." Colonel Matthews leaned forward slightly, his attention completely focused on her words. "I'm listening, Lieutenant." Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would either destroy her military career or transform her into something the world had never seen before. A female combat pilot who had proven herself in battle against impossible odds. "Sir," she said, looking directly into the colonel's eyes, "my name isn't Samuel Chun. It's Sarah Chun. And everything I did this morning, I learned from the best pilot who ever flew in the First World War." The silence that followed her revelation was profound and complete. Colonel Matthews stared at her with an expression of absolute shock, while Harrison's mouth dropped open as he tried to process what he had just heard. Outside, the sounds of normal base operations continued, but inside the small office, the world had suddenly changed forever. Sarah straightened her shoulders and met their stares with quiet dignity. After 8 months of lies and deception, after 12 minutes of aerial combat that had proven her worth beyond any doubt, she was finally free to be herself. Whatever happened next, she had shown the world that courage, skill, and determination knew no boundaries of gender or expectation. The woman who had hidden her wings for so long was ready to let the world see her fly.